Sometimes the people who should love you most are the ones who hurt you deepest. There's nothing quite like the pain of being cast aside by your own family, told you're worthless because you can't give them what they want. This is what happened to Astrid in 9th century Norway. Her father called her barren and useless, then sold her to a merchant like she was nothing more than broken pottery. She thought her life was over. But when a giant warrior named Bjorn saw the exchange, he didn't see damaged goods. He saw something her own blood had missed. He paid 5 times her price and took her north to the frozen lands. There, far from those who rejected her, Astrid discovered she had value beyond what anyone imagined. She became a healer, a keeper of stories, a true partner to a man who saw her worth. What happens when her father comes back, wanting to reclaim the daughter he once threw away? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the fjord like the breath of ancient gods, rising from waters so dark they seemed to hold the memory of every ship that had ever sailed these treacherous channels. Astrid's fingers traced the worn silver pendant at her throat, her mother's last gift before the fever took her 10 winters past. The metal had grown warm against her skin during the sleepless night, as if Solveig's spirit still watched over the daughter she'd left behind in a world that measured women by their ability to bear sons. The village of Thornwick nestled against the mountainside like a cluster of weathered barnacles, its timber halls and stone foundations speaking of generations who had carved their lives from this unforgiving landscape. Smoke rose from morning hearths, carrying the scent of barley bread and salted fish that had sustained these people since the time of the old kings. But for Astrid, the familiar aromas now carried the bitter taste of rejection. She sat on the wooden bench outside her father's great hall, watching the merchants prepare their wares for the day's trading. Their voices carried across the courtyard in a mixture of Norse dialects and foreign tongues, Frankish, Saxon, even the guttural sounds of the Eastern Rus who brought amber and furs down from the frozen wastes. These men travelled freely, their worth measured in silver and the stories they could tell of distant lands. How different their lives were from hers, bound by blood and custom to a fate she had never chosen. Jarl Einar emerged from the hall, his broad frame filling the doorway as he surveyed his domain with the calculating gaze of a man who had learned to measure everything in terms of gain and loss. His beard, once golden like her own hair, had turned the color of winter wheat streaked with silver. The weight of leadership sat heavy on his shoulders, heavier still since the failed harvest 2 summers past and the tribute demanded by King Harald's tax collectors. "The merchant Olaf will arrive before the sun reaches its peak," he said without looking at her, his voice carrying the tone he might use to discuss the sale of livestock. "See that you are prepared." Astrid's hand tightened around the pendant. "Father, surely there is another way. I could tend the sick, help with what?" Einar's blue eyes, so much like her own, finally met hers. But where hers held the depth of hidden waters, his had grown hard as winter ice. What use is a daughter who cannot give her husband sons? What alliance can be forged with a barren woman as the bride price? The words struck her like physical blows, each one carefully aimed to remind her of her greatest failure. 3 years wed to Hakon the Strong, and her womb had remained as empty as a broken pot. The village wise women had declared it the will of the gods' punishment for some unseen transgression. Her husband had cast her aside and taken a younger wife within a moon's turning, leaving her to return to her father's hall, in shame. "Your mother," she began, but Einar raised a hand to silence her. "Your mother gave me 3 sons before you were born," he said, though his voice softened slightly at Solveig's memory. 2 died in their cradles, but Magnus lived to become a warrior. She fulfilled her duty. You have not. Magnus. Her brother's name still brought both comfort and pain. He had sailed with Ragnar Ironside to raid the Saxon monasteries 3 springs ago and never returned. Some said his ship had foundered in a storm off the Orkney Islands. Others whispered that Saxon defenders had sent him to Valhalla with steel through his heart. Either way, his death had left Einar without an heir, and Astrid as his only remaining child, a bitter reminder of dreams that would die with him. The sound of approaching horses drew their attention to the path that wound, down from the mountain passes. A small party of riders emerged from the morning mist, their mounts picking careful steps along the rocky trail. At their head rode a man whose presence seemed to command the very air around him. Even at a distance, his size was unmistakable, broader across the shoulders than any man in Thornwick, sitting his horse with the easy confidence of one born to leadership. "Bjorn Ironside of the Frostlands," Einar murmured, and Astrid heard something like surprise in his voice. "I did not expect him to come this far south." The name was legend throughout the northern kingdoms. Bjorn the Shield-bearer, they called him, champion of a dozen battles who had stood at the right hand of kings. His exploits in the great raid on the Frankish cities had been sung by skalds from Iceland to the Russian steppes. Yet for all his fame as a warrior, recent years had brought different stories, tales of a man who had laid down his sword and sought something other than glory. In battle, the party rode into the courtyard, their travel-stained cloaks and well-worn gear, speaking of long days on mountain trails. Bjorn dismounted with fluid grace, despite his massive frame, his grey eyes taking in the hall and its inhabitants with the practiced assessment of a man accustomed to reading the intentions of strangers. His hair fell to his shoulders in dark waves, touched with early silver, and a scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, a souvenir from some forgotten battle that only added to his commanding presence. "Jarl Einar," Bjorn's voice carried easily across the courtyard, deep and measured like distant thunder. "I hope the morning finds you well." Einar stepped forward, extending the formal greeting due to a guest of such standing. "Bjorn Ironside, you honor my hall. What brings the great shield-bearer to our humble fjord?" "Trade and news from the northern settlements," Bjorn replied, though his gaze had already found Astrid where she sat. Something flickered in his expression, not the dismissive glance most men gave her now, but a deeper consideration that made her suddenly conscious of her appearance, and perhaps to witness what the merchants of the Southlands bring to offer. As if summoned by those words, another party arrived, this one led by the merchant Olaf, whose silver arm rings spoke of profitable ventures across the sea lanes. His narrow face bore the calculating expression of a man who reduced all human interactions to matters of profit and loss. Behind him rode two guards, whose hands rested easily on their sword hilts, and a third man, whose chains and hunched posture marked him as already destined for the slave markets of Dublin or Hedeby. "Jarl Einar," Olaf called out, his voice pitched with the false cheer of a man conducting distasteful business. "I trust you have considered my offer?" The pendant seemed to grow heavier against Astrid's chest as her father nodded grimly. "The terms you named last week, 6 silver marks for my daughter's service. The bargain stands if you still find it acceptable. 6 silver marks, the price of a good milk cow or a handful of iron tools. Less than half what a skilled thrall might bring at market." The number burned in her mind like a brand, marking her true worth in her father's eyes. She had known this moment would come since Olaf's last visit, but hearing the actual sum made her stomach clench with a mixture of rage and despair. Olaf approached with the air of a man examining livestock, his pale eyes assessing her as he might evaluate a horse's teeth or a cow's condition. "She appears healthy enough, though I confess her reputation for barrenness concerns some potential buyers. Still, she's young and strong, and there's always demand for household servants in the Irish kingdoms." Household servants. The euphemism did little to disguise what her life would become if she was fortunate enough to avoid the brothels that catered to foreign sailors and merchants. "The bargain is struck," Einar said, though she noticed he could not quite meet her eyes. "Payment in silver, as agreed." Olaf reached for the leather purse at his belt, but before he could count out the coins, Bjorn stepped forward. His movement was casual, almost lazy, but somehow it placed him between the merchant and Astrid, with the smooth inevitability of a hawk stooping on prey. 30 silver marks, he said simply. The courtyard fell silent except for the distant cry of gulls wheeling over the fjord. Olaf's mouth opened and closed like a landed fish, while Einar stared at the warrior with undisguised shock. 30 marks was a fortune enough to pay the king's tribute for 2 years, or purchase a longship of decent size. You would bid against me for this woman? Olaf's voice cracked with outrage. She is barren, cursed by the gods. What possible use could you have for 30 marks? Bjorn repeated, his tone suggesting the matter was closed. In hack, silver, weighed true. His hand moved to the heavy purse at his side, the gesture emphasizing that he possessed the means to make good on his offer. Astrid found herself staring at this stranger, who had just valued her at 5 times what her own father had accepted. His face revealed nothing of his motivations, no lust, no pity, no calculation of profit. Just a calm certainty that spoke of a man accustomed to having his decisions questioned, but rarely changed. This is madness, Olaf sputtered. 30 marks for a barren woman. You could buy 10 slaves for such a price, or a ship, or I could buy many things, Bjorn agreed. But I choose to buy her freedom from your service. His grey eyes found Astrid's across the courtyard, and for a moment she felt as though he could see straight through to her soul. The question is whether Jarl Einar finds my offer acceptable. Her father's face had gone through several shades of red and pale as he struggled to process this unexpected turn. 30 marks would solve his immediate problems and provide a cushion against future misfortunes. But it also meant selling his daughter to a man whose reputation, while honorable, included whispers of strangeness in recent years. Some said he had grown soft, abandoning the warrior's path for pursuits better suited to old men and skalds. It is acceptable, Einar said finally, though his voice carried a note of bewilderment. More than acceptable. But I must ask, what do you intend for her? Bjorn's smile was slight but genuine, transforming his scarred features with an unexpected warmth. I intend to take her north to my hall, where she will serve as she chooses to serve. Nothing more, nothing less. He turned to face Astrid directly, and she felt the full weight of his attention like standing before a hearth fire. The choice, when we reach my lands, will be hers to make. Choice. The word fell into the morning air like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through everything she thought she understood about her situation. When had she last been offered a choice in anything that mattered? When had anyone cared what she might choose for herself? The silver changed hands with efficient ceremony, Bjorn's purse proving to contain exactly the promised amount in good hack silver pieces cut from arm rings and ingots, each fragment tested and weighed to ensure fair value. Olaf departed with poor grace, muttering about madmen and their coin, while the other merchants turned their attention to more conventional business with the Jarl. As the morning wore on toward noon, Astrid found herself in the strange position of belonging to a man she had never spoken to, yet feeling more free than she had in years. Bjorn conducted his other business with quiet efficiency, trading northern furs and amber for southern iron and grain, his manner suggesting this unexpected purchase had been merely another transaction among many. But when their eyes met, across the courtyard, as she gathered her few possessions, she saw something that made her heart quicken with an emotion she could not name. It might have been hope. The preparation for departure took place under the watchful eyes of the entire village. Word of Bjorn's unprecedented purchase had spread like wildfire through Thornwick's narrow lanes, and Astrid felt the weight of curious stares as she secured her meagre belongings to the pack-horse he had provided. Her entire life reduced to a single leather satchel, a spare dress, her mother's bone comb, and the few precious items that marked her passage through 23 summers. The bronze-handled knife that hung at her side had belonged to her grandmother, passed down through 3 generations of women who had known their place in the world. Now it would travel to lands she had never seen, carried by a woman whose place remained undefined. The blade caught the afternoon light as she adjusted its position, and she wondered if her grandmother had ever felt this mixture of terror and anticipation. "You need not look back," Bjorn said quietly, leading his massive stallion to where she stood beside the smaller mare he had chosen for her use. His voice held the same calm certainty she had heard in the courtyard, but now she caught undertones of something else, perhaps understanding of what it meant to leave everything familiar behind. "I have nowhere else to look," she replied, surprised by her own honesty. The words emerged before she could consider their wisdom, but Bjorn merely nodded, as though she had spoken perfect sense. Her father emerged from the hall one final time, his face set in the carefully neutral expression of a man determined not to show weakness before his people. The 30 silver marks had already disappeared into his strongbox, payment for debts and future security that her presence had threatened. Yet something in his eyes suggested the transaction sat less easily on his conscience than his words had implied. "Astrid!" His voice carried across the courtyard with the formal tone reserved for important announcements. "Serve your new master well. Remember that you carry the blood of Jarls, even if—" He stopped, the unfinished thought hanging between them like smoke from a dying fire. Even if that blood had failed to fulfill its purpose. Even if she had proven unworthy of the lineage that should have defined her, the words he did not speak cut deeper than any he had ever voiced aloud. "I will remember," she said, though what exactly she would remember remained unclear even to herself. The love he had shown her as a child, before her failure became apparent? The disappointment that had grown like ice between them? Or simply that she had once belonged somewhere, even if that belonging had come with conditions she could not meet? Bjorn swung into his saddle with the fluid grace of a man born to horseback, his massive frame making even the war-trained stallion seem smaller than it was. His two companions, men whose names she had learned were Eric and Thorvald, took their positions as rear guard, their eyes already scanning the mountain trails for potential threats. These northern passes held dangers beyond wolves and weather, and successful merchants knew to watch for the desperate men who haunted the lonely places. As they rode through Thornwick's gates for what might be the final time, Astrid felt something crack inside her chest. Not her heart breaking, but some hard shell that had formed around it during the long months of shame and rejection. The sensation was neither entirely painful nor pleasant, like the first thaw after a brutal winter when ice gave way to uncertain ground beneath. The trail climbed steadily through forests of pine and birch, following ancient paths carved by generations of travelers seeking their fortunes in distant markets. The air grew thinner and colder as they gained elevation, carrying scents of snow and stone that spoke of the vast wilderness stretching beyond the inhabited valleys. This was the edge of the known world for most southerners, but Bjorn guided his horse with the confidence of a man returning home. During the first night's camp, sheltered in a grove beside a rushing stream, Astrid learned something of her new circumstances. Bjorn made no attempt to claim the rights his purchase might have granted, instead ensuring she had adequate furs for warmth and positioning his own bedroll on the opposite side of the fire. His men followed his lead, treating her with the respectful distance they might show any woman under their leader's protection. "Where do your lands lie?" she asked, as they shared the evening meal of dried meat and flat bread. The question had been building inside her since they left Thornwick, but fear of seeming presumptuous had held her tongue. 3 days north along the mountain spine, where the great glacier feeds a series of lakes, Bjorn replied, his scarred hands steady as he carved portions of cheese with his eating knife. "The holding is not large by southern standards, but it supports those who dwell there well enough. And what would you have me do there?" The words emerged more boldly than she had intended, but something in his manner invited directness rather than the careful deference she had learned to employ with her father and former husband. Bjorn was quiet for a long moment, his grey eyes reflecting the firelight as he considered his answer. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of careful thought. I purchased your freedom, not your service. What you choose to do with that freedom will depend upon what you discover about yourself in the days to come. Freedom. The concept felt as foreign as the distant lands the merchants described in their tales. She had been daughter, wife, and now something unnamed but never simply herself, with choices that belonged to no one else. The possibility was both exhilarating and terrifying. I do not understand, she said finally. If you wanted nothing from me, why spend such a sum? 30 marks could purchase many things, as I told the merchant. Bjorn's smile held a hint of sadness she had not noticed before. But none of them would have prevented an injustice I had the power to remedy. He poked the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling into the star-filled darkness. I have seen too many good people broken by circumstances beyond their control. When I have the means to change such circumstances, I choose to act. But you know nothing of me. I could be lazy, or dishonest, or cursed by the gods. His tone held gentle mockery that took the sting from the words. I watched you in your father's courtyard before the merchant arrived. I saw how you held yourself with dignity despite knowing what was coming. I saw the care with which you touched that pendant at your throat, and the love that still showed in your eyes when you looked at a father who was selling you to strangers. He met her gaze across the fire. Such things speak of character that cannot be feigned. The bronze knife at her side seemed to grow warm against her leg, as though responding to his words with some memory of the strong women who had carried it before her. Her grandmother had been known for her wisdom in healing and her skill at reading the intentions of men. Perhaps some part of that gift had passed down through the generations, allowing her to sense the truth in this stranger's words. The wise women say I am barren, she said, needing to voice the shame that defined her in the eyes of others, that the gods have marked me as unfit to bear children. Does this not concern you? Should it? Bjorn's response came without hesitation. A woman's worth lies in more than her womb, just as a man's lies in more than his sword arm. I learned this truth through experience that came at considerable cost. His hand moved, unconsciously, to the scar on his jaw, and she sensed there were stories behind that gesture, stories of loss and learning that had shaped the man who now offered her an alternative to the fate her family had chosen. The night sounds of the wilderness surrounded them, the distant call of an owl, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush, the eternal whisper of wind through pine boughs. These were the sounds of a world that continued its ancient rhythms, regardless of human plans and disappointments. For the first time in months, Astrid felt herself part of something larger than the narrow confines of her personal failure. As she settled into her furs for sleep, the bronze knife beside her and the silver pendant warm against her skin, she realized that everything she had believed about her life had changed in the space of a single day. Tomorrow would bring new landscapes and new possibilities, but tonight she was content to rest in the care of a man who saw value where others saw only disappointment. The last thing she heard before sleep claimed her was Bjorn's deep voice, speaking quietly to his companions as they planned the next day's journey. His tone carried the authority of command, but also something else. A gentleness that suggested her welfare had become a consideration in their planning. It was such a small thing being considered, but it felt like the first step toward understanding what freedom might actually mean. The second day of their journey brought them deeper into the mountain passes, where the trees grew sparse and the air carried the sharp bite of glacial winds. Astrid had never traveled this far from the coastal valleys, and each turn in the trail revealed landscapes that belonged more to legend than the world she knew. Peaks rose like the spears of frost giants against the pale sky, their summits lost in clouds that promised snow despite the late summer season. The carved wooden cup that Bjorn offered her at their morning meal bore intricate knotwork patterns, ravens and wolves intertwined with symbols she did not recognize. When she complimented its craftsmanship, his weathered face brightened with the first genuine pleasure she had seen him display. "My sister made this many years ago," he said, turning the cup to show her where tiny runes spelled out words of protection and good fortune. She had great skill with blade and brush, could carve stories into wood that would make the skalds weep with envy. His voice carried the weight of loss, and Astrid understood without asking that his sister walked the path to Valhalla now. As they rode through a narrow defile where ancient rockfalls had left the trail barely wide enough for their horses, Eric called a halt from his position at the rear. His weathered face bore the expression of a man who had learned to trust his instincts in dangerous places, and when he spoke, his voice carried the authority of long experience. "Riders behind us, maybe half a day back," he reported to Bjorn. "3 horses, moving faster than merchants would travel. Could be bandits looking for easy prey, or someone following our particular trail." Bjorn finished, his grey eyes finding Astrid's face with sudden intensity. Who might wish to reclaim what they have sold? The question hit her like a physical blow. Her father, or perhaps someone acting on his behalf, pursuing them through the mountain passes. But why? The silver had been paid and accepted. The transaction was complete by any reasonable measure. Unless something had changed in the hours after their departure, some new calculation that made her presence more valuable than 30 silver marks. "Could my father have sent men after us?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer. Einar was nothing if not practical, and if circumstances had shifted to make her retrieval profitable, he would not hesitate to pursue that advantage. Men change their minds when they have time to consider. "Missed opportunities," Thorvald observed from his position, scouting ahead. "Perhaps he received news that made your sail seem premature." The thought chilled her more than the mountain wind. What news could have come to Thornwick in the hours after their departure? Word from King Harold's court about some political arrangement that required a well-born daughter as marriage alliance? Information about her former husband's new wife, failing to produce the sons he demanded? Any number of circumstances could have transformed her from burden to valuable asset overnight. Bjorn studied the trail behind them with the calculating gaze of a man who had survived countless dangers through careful planning. "We are still 2 days from my lands, but there are defensible positions ahead if pursuit proves hostile." He turned to Astrid, and she saw both determination and concern in his expression. "I need you to understand something clearly. The silver I paid makes you my responsibility now, not merely by law but by honor. Whatever comes, you will not be returned against your will." The words should have brought comfort, but instead they highlighted the precarious nature of her situation. She had no weapons beyond her grandmother's knife, no fighting skills that would prove useful in a confrontation. If violence came, she would be a burden to the very men who had promised to protect her. "I can ride hard if needed," she offered, though they all knew her smaller horse would struggle to match the pace of their war-trained mounts over rough terrain. "I will not slow your escape if—" "There will be no escape," Bjorn said with quiet certainty. "If your father sent men to reclaim you, they come seeking profit from what they see as a business transaction. Such men can be reasoned with, bought off, or, if necessary, convinced through other means that their pursuit is unwise." The steel in his voice reminded her that beneath his gentle manner lay the warrior whose reputation had spread across the northern kingdoms. She had heard the songs that chronicled his battles, but witnessing the shift in his demeanor from protector to potential predator gave those tales new meaning. This was not a man who would yield easily to pressure, regardless of its source. They pushed hard through the afternoon, following trails that climbed steadily toward the high passes where glacial lakes reflected the sky like mirrors set in stone. The landscape grew more desolate as they gained elevation, vast sweeps of barren rock broken by patches of hardy grass and the occasional stand of wind-twisted trees. This was the edge of the inhabited world, where only the hardiest souls made their homes. As evening approached, they reached a place where the trail split, one path continuing north toward Bjorn's lands, the other climbing east toward the glacier itself. Here, ancient travelers had built a shelter from carefully fitted stones, its roof long since collapsed, but its walls still, offering protection from the worst mountain weather. "We make camp here," Bjorn decided after examining the position. The shelter sat on a small rise that commanded views in all directions, with no approach that could not be observed well in advance. "If we are being followed, this is where we will meet our pursuers, on ground of our choosing." As his men prepared their defensive positions with the efficiency of long practice, Astrid found herself thinking about the carved cup and the sister who had made it. There was something in Bjorn's manner when he spoke of family that suggested deep wells of pain beneath his controlled exterior. Perhaps he, too, understood what it meant to lose those who should have protected you, to find yourself alone in a world that measured worth in narrow terms. "Tell me about your sister," she said as they shared the evening meal within the shelter's broken walls. The request surprised her with its boldness, but something about their situation poised, between the past that hunted them and the uncertain future ahead, seemed to invite confession. Bjorn's hands stilled on the cup, and for a moment she thought he would refuse to answer. But when he spoke, his words carried the weight of memories long held in silence. "Sigrid was 3 years my elder, and twice as wise," he said simply. "She could read the runes and speak with the land spirits, knew the old ways our grandmother taught before the new kings brought their southern customs north." His fingers traced the carved patterns on the cup's surface. She might have been a great vulva, a seer whose counsel would be sought by jarls and kings. Instead, she died birthing a child whose father cared more for his political ambitions than her welfare. The parallel to her own situation was not lost on either of them. Another woman reduced to her reproductive function, another life sacrificed to male expectations and dynastic planning. The knowledge created a bridge of understanding between them that needed no words to cross. The cup seemed to catch and hold the firelight as Bjorn set it carefully aside, its carved ravens appearing to move in the dancing shadows. Tomorrow would bring whatever pursuit followed them, but tonight they shared the communion of survivors who had learned that worth must be defined from within rather than imposed from without. Dawn brought riders cresting the southern ridge, 3 men mounted on horses whose labored breathing spoke of hard travel through the night. Even at a distance, Astrid recognized the lead rider's bearing and the distinctive blue cloak that marked her father's household guard. Gunnar the Red, her father's most trusted warrior, had come to retrieve what Einar now apparently considered stolen property. The iron Thor's hammer that hung from Gunnar's neck caught the morning light as he dismounted, its presence both decoration and declaration. She had known this man since childhood, had listened to his stories of raids and battles during long winter evenings in her father's hall. Now he approached their defensive position with the grim determination of someone fulfilling an unwelcome duty. "Bjorn Ironside," Gunnar called across the stone-strewn ground between them. His voice carried the formal cadence of official business, stripped of the warmth she remembered from her youth. "I come bearing words from Jarl Einar of Thornwick." Bjorn emerged from behind the ruined wall where he had taken position, his own weapons visible but not drawn. His companions flanked him at careful intervals, creating a triangle of steel that could respond to threats from multiple directions. The morning air felt charged with the potential for violence, like the moments before a thunderstorm breaks across mountain peaks. "Speak your words, Gunnar," Bjorn replied with equal formality. "Though I confess surprise at finding Einar's men so far from their customary hunting grounds. The Jarl has received disturbing news," Gunnar said, his weathered face showing the strain of the hard ride. "Word came from King Harold's court that changes the circumstances of yesterday's transaction. The king seeks alliance with the Irish lords of Dublin, and requires high-born daughters to seal the bargain with marriage. Astrid's lineage makes her valuable to this purpose. The words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples that touched everything Astrid thought she understood about her situation. A political marriage to an Irish lord, the very fate her barrenness had supposedly made impossible. But kings and their advisors sometimes valued bloodlines over proven fertility, especially when alliances hung in the balance. An interesting development, Bjorn observed, though his tone suggested he found it anything but. Yet the transaction was completed in good faith, with proper witnesses and fair payment. What does Jarl Einar propose to remedy this supposed complication? Gunnar's hand moved, unconsciously toward his sword hilt, before stopping a gesture that revealed his own discomfort with his mission. Return of the woman and repayment of the silver. The Jarl acknowledges his error and offers compensation for your inconvenience. And if I decline this generous offer? The question hung in the mountain air like mist, carrying implications that all present understood. Gunnar had brought 2 companions, capable men, but not nearly enough to guarantee victory against Bjorn and his seasoned warriors. Yet behind them stood the authority of a Jarl, and ultimately a king whose reach extended throughout the northern kingdoms. The king's will carries weight in all his lands, Gunnar said carefully. Opposition to royal commands has consequences beyond any personal dispute. Astrid felt the weight of political forces pressing down upon her like an avalanche waiting to fall. In the space between heartbeats, she had gone from barren outcast to valuable political asset, but only as a commodity to be traded between powerful men for their own purposes. The freedom Bjorn had promised her seemed as fragile as morning frost before the summer sun. I see, Bjorn said quietly. His grey eyes found hers across the defensive perimeter, and she saw something in his expression that steadied her racing heart. Perhaps we should ask the woman herself what she prefers. After all, she is the subject of this negotiation. Gunnar's face flushed with surprise and anger. She is a daughter of Jarls, not some thrall whose opinions matter in such affairs. Her father's word governs her fate as law and custom demand. Custom, Bjorn repeated thoughtfully. An interesting word. Custom also holds that a purchase made in good faith cannot be undone by the seller's regret. Custom demands that guests be received with honor rather than pursued like thieves. Perhaps we should examine which customs truly serve justice in this matter. The iron hammer at Gunnar's throat swayed as he stepped forward, his patience clearly wearing thin. Enough of this wordplay. The woman returns with us, willing or not. The king's business will not be delayed by philosophical debates. Astrid rose from her position behind the broken wall, her grandmother's knife visible at her side, though she made no threatening gestures. The bronze handle felt warm in her grip, as if the spirits of the strong women who had carried it before her were lending their strength to this moment. I have a voice in this matter, she said, her words carrying clearly across the rocky ground. And I choose to continue north with Bjorn Ironside. Whatever the king may want, I am not cattle to be herded where others will. Gunnar's expression shifted from surprise to something approaching pity. Child, you do not understand the forces at work here. This is not about your personal desires, but about the good of the kingdom. Your marriage to an Irish lord could prevent war, secure trade routes, strengthen alliances that will benefit thousands. And if I die in childbirth, as your lord's sister did? The question emerged with bitter clarity. Will those thousands mourn my sacrifice, or simply find another high-born daughter to take my place? The reference to Sigrid hit Bjorn like a visible blow, his jaw tightening as painful memories surfaced. But it also seemed to crystallize something in his resolve, transforming him from reluctant participant to active defender. The woman has chosen, he said with finality. That choice was purchased with good silver and sealed with honest intentions. If King Harold requires an alliance with Irish lords, let him find volunteers among those who serve him willingly. Steel rang as Gunnar drew his sword, the sound echoing off the mountain walls like the voice of fate itself. His companions followed suit, their faces grim but determined. 3 against 3, with right and wrong balanced on the edge of battle-tested blades. "So be it," Gunnar said sadly. "I had hoped for a peaceful resolution, but some duties cannot be avoided." The iron hammer caught the light one final time as he raised his weapon. "For king and kingdom, for honor and choice," Bjorn replied, his own blade singing from its sheath with deadly music. The battle that would determine Astrid's future was about to begin on ground where ancient stones had witnessed countless struggles between those who would command and those who would resist. Steel met steel with the harsh music of warriors, testing each other's resolve. Gunnar fought with the efficient brutality that had kept him alive through decades of battle, his blade seeking the gaps in Bjorn's defense with practiced precision. But the larger man moved with surprising grace for his size, turning aside each attack while his own counterstrikes forced Gunnar to give ground on the uneven terrain. The bone-handled seeks that Eric drew from his belt bore the stains of many encounters, its curved blade, designed for the close work that decided battles after the shield wall broke. He faced Gunnar's younger companion with the calm patience of a veteran who had learned to let inexperience defeat itself. The younger man's wild swings spoke of courage but little wisdom, and Eric waited for the opening that would end their dance without unnecessary bloodshed. Astrid found herself frozen between terror and fascination as violence erupted around her. She had witnessed fights before, tavern brawls and honor duels that settled disputes between drunk warriors, but nothing like this deliberate application of lethal skill. These men were not fighting in anger but from necessity, each blow calculated to achieve a specific outcome rather than simply harm an opponent. Thorvald had positioned himself to guard the horses, preventing Gunnar's men from fleeing with their mounts if the battle turned against them. His long spear gave him reach advantage over his opponent's sword, but the confined space between rock walls limited his ability to use that advantage effectively. The two circled each other like wolves, seeking the moment when position and opportunity would align. "Yield," Bjorn called to Gunnar as their blades locked at the guard, their faces close enough to share breath in the morning cold. "Your king's business can wait for proper negotiation. No one need die on these stones." "The king's business waits for no one," Gunnar replied through gritted teeth, using his leverage to break the bind and step back for another attack. "You should have taken the silver and let matters rest." Their conversation continued in the language of cross steel, each exchange revealing more about the men behind the weapons. Gunnar fought with the desperate efficiency of someone who knew failure meant disgrace, while Bjorn's movements carried the controlled power of a man defending something precious. The difference in motivation began to tell as the minutes passed, and Gunnar's breathing grew labored. The turning point came when Eric's patience bore fruit. His young opponent overextended on a particularly ambitious thrust, and the veteran's curved blade found the gap between mail shirt and leather vambrace. The wound was not mortal, but it sent the man's weapon spinning from suddenly nerveless fingers. Eric did not press his advantage, instead stepping back to allow surrender without loss of honor. Seeing his companion fall, Gunnar's remaining ally made the fatal error of divided attention. Thorvald's spear point took him through the shoulder, pinning him against the broken wall with a precision that spoke of deliberate restraint. Like Eric, the older warrior had chosen to disable rather than kill, leaving room for mercy if wisdom prevailed. Alone now against 3 uninjured opponents, Gunnar nevertheless raised his blade for another exchange. The iron hammer at his throat caught the light as he moved, its weight a reminder of the oaths that bound him to his mission regardless of odds or circumstances. "Your men are defeated but not dead," Bjorn observed, his own sword held ready but not threatening. "They can return to their families whole if you choose wisdom over stubborn duty." "My duty is to the crown and my lord," Gunnar replied, though sweat beaded his forehead despite the mountain chill. I cannot return empty-handed and claim to have fulfilled either obligation. Then perhaps we can find a different solution." Astrid's voice cut through the tension like a bell struck in. Silence. All eyes turned to her as she stepped forward, her grandmother's knife still at her side, but her hands empty and open. One that serves honor without requiring blood. Gunnar's weathered face showed confusion and something that might have been hope. What solution could there be? The king wants a high-born bride for his Irish alliance, and you are the daughter chosen for that purpose. But I am also, a woman declared, barren by the wise women of Tendar. Thornwick, she replied with steady conviction. Would King Harold truly offer damaged goods to potential allies? Would such a marriage not risk insulting those he seeks to court? The logic of her words struck Gunnar like a physical blow. Political marriages were delicate affairs where perceived slights could destroy negotiations before they began. Offering a bride known to be barren might be seen as mockery rather than honor, particularly by lords whose own legitimacy depended upon producing heirs. "The wise women could be wrong," he said, but uncertainty crept into his voice. "They could be," Astrid agreed, "but would you stake the kingdom's alliance on that possibility? Would you counsel your king to risk war with Ireland because you gambled on one woman's fertility against the judgment of those who speak with the spirits?" Bjorn's eyes held quiet admiration as he watched her turn the very shame that had driven her from her father's hall into a weapon for her own defense. The tact barrenness that had made her worthless in one context now served as armor against unwanted marriage in another. "There is wisdom in what she says," Eric observed, from his position guarding the wounded man. "Kings rarely thank those who bring them complicated problems disguised as simple solutions." Gunnar lowered his sword slowly, the weight of conflicting loyalties visible in every line of his body. His duty to his lord warred with his growing recognition that returning Astrid might create more problems than it solved. The iron hammer swayed as he struggled with the implications of his choice. "If I return to report failure," he said finally, "Jarl Einar's position with the king will suffer. He has already spent the silver you paid, counting on royal favor to solve his financial troubles." "Then perhaps," Bjorn suggested carefully, "your report should emphasize the wisdom of finding a different candidate for the king's purpose, one whose fertility is proven and whose marriage would carry no risk of diplomatic insult." The bone-handled CX gleamed in Eric's grip as he helped the wounded man bind his injury. The veteran's actions, speaking of honor codes that valued mercy over victory. Such gestures could tip the balance when warriors faced choices between duty and wisdom. Gunnar studied Astrid's face as though seeing her clearly for the first time, perhaps recognizing the strength that had sustained her through rejection and sale. "You would truly choose exile in the northern wastes over marriage to Irish royalty." "I choose freedom to discover my own worth," she replied. "That path lies north, with Bjorn Ironside, not south to Dublin's marriage bed." The iron hammer caught the morning light one final time as Gunnar sheathed his weapon, the gesture signaling his acceptance of arguments that served honor without demanding blood. The remainder of their journey to Bjorn's lands unfolded through landscapes that seemed carved from the dreams of the old gods. They followed ancient paths beside glacial lakes whose depths held reflections of mountains that touched the sky, while eagles circled overhead on wings that caught the thin air like sails. This was a country that demanded respect from those who would dwell within its borders, offering abundance to those who understood its ways, but death to those who did not. The leather-bound journal that Bjorn carried in his saddlebags emerged during their final evening camp, its pages yellowed with age and covered in the careful script of someone who valued knowledge above silver. As they shared the warmth of their fire within a circle of standing stones left by travelers long dead, he opened the worn volume to show her passages written in multiple hands. "My family has kept records of this land for 7 generations, he explained, his finger tracing entries that chronicled harvests and harsh winters, successful hunts and lean seasons. Each holder of these lands has added their observations, creating a guide for those who come after. Astrid leaned closer to examine the precise runic characters that recorded practical wisdom alongside personal reflections. Here was knowledge gained through hard experience, which valleys provided the best grazing, where to find medicinal herbs, how to read the signs that warned of avalanche or early frost. But interspersed with such practical matters were entries of deeper significance. The land spirits grow restless when blood is shed carelessly. She read from an entry dated 15 winters past. Better to lose cattle to wolves than to hunt in anger and poison the hunting grounds with unnecessary death. This was written by someone who understood more than survival. My father wrote those words after a dispute with neighboring clans nearly led to war, Bjorn said quietly. He chose to pay compensation rather than seek revenge, and the land rewarded that wisdom with the best hunting seasons in living memory. His grey eyes reflected the firelight as he turned to a more recent entry. I added my own thoughts after choosing to leave the warrior's path. The page he showed her contained fewer words, but carried greater weight. A man may gain the whole world through conquest, yet lose his soul in the taking. Better to tend one's own ground well than to expand it through violence that breeds only more violence. Such philosophy seemed at odds with his reputation as a legendary warrior, yet Astrid was beginning to understand that reputation could be a burden as much as a blessing. The songs celebrated his victories, but said nothing of the cost paid by the man who lived with the memory of those he had killed in service to other men's ambitions. "What changed your mind about the warrior's life?" she asked, though she suspected the answer would touch on painful ground. Bjorn was quiet for a long time, his scarred hands steady as he closed the journal and set it carefully aside. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of choices that had shaped everything that followed. I spent 10 years earning gold and glory in service to King Magnus, believing that strength in battle was the highest virtue a man could achieve, he began, his voice barely audible above the crackling flames. I led raids that filled royal treasuries with Saxon silver and Frankish goods. I stood in shield walls that broke enemy lines and won victories that scolds still sing. The fire popped and sent sparks spiraling into the star-filled darkness, each point of light briefly illuminating their faces before dying away. Around them, the standing stones seemed to lean inward like ancient listeners, gathering to hear tales of human folly and wisdom. But with each battle, I found myself questioning what we were truly accomplishing. We called it honor, but it looked more like theft to the families whose sons we killed and whose daughters we carried off as slaves. His hand moved unconsciously to the scar on his jaw, and she saw how deeply those questions had cut. The final campaign was against a Frankish monastery that the king claimed harbored spies. Astrid waited in silence, sensing that interruption would break the fragile thread by which he held these memories. The leather journal beside him seemed to pulse with the accumulated wisdom of generations, a reminder that some truths could only be learned through direct experience of loss. We found no spies, only monks who tended their books and gardens in peace. But orders were orders, and we put the place to fire and sword as commanded. Bjorn's voice grew even quieter, forcing her to strain to catch his words. I personally killed 3 men whose only crime was trying to protect their library from destruction. The last was barely older than you, a scribe whose hands were stained with ink rather than blood. The weight of that confession settled between them like a stone dropped into deep water. She began to understand why a man who could have claimed lands and titles through conquest had instead chosen this remote holding where his greatest enemies were winter storms and crop failures. That night, as we camped among the burning ruins, I dreamed of my sister Sigrid, he continued. She spoke to me of the balance that governs all things, how violence begets violence until the cycle consumes those who feed it. When I woke, I knew I could no longer serve causes that required me to kill good people for bad reasons. The leather journal caught the firelight as he touched its cover again, and Astrid realized it represented more than family records. It was his attempt to create something constructive from the destruction he had witnessed, to build rather than tear down. "So, you came here to find peace?" "I came here to learn what peace actually means," he corrected gently, "and to discover whether a man who has dealt in death can somehow make amends by choosing to protect life instead." The question hung in, the cold mountain air between them, and Astrid sensed it was one he asked himself daily without finding easy answers. She thought of the monk he had killed, young, innocent, devoted to preserving knowledge rather than destroying it, and wondered if such debts could ever be fully paid. "Perhaps," she said carefully, "amends are made not through single grand gestures but through countless small choices to act with honor." The leather binding creaked softly as Bjorn reopened the journal to its most recent entries, and she saw that many recorded acts of kindness rather than conquest, helping neighboring families through hard winters, mediating disputes without bloodshed, offering sanctuary to those who needed shelter from various storms. "Perhaps you are right," he said, though uncertainty lingered in his voice. "Tomorrow you will see the home I have tried to build from such hopes." Bjorn's holding revealed itself at dawn, like a vision from the old stories, a collection of Ovis. Well-built structures, nestled in a valley where 3 mountain streams converged to form a lake, so clear it seemed made of polished silver. Smoke rose from chimneys carved with protective runes, while fields of barley and oats stretched toward slopes where cattle grazed beneath the watchful eyes of shepherds. This was prosperity earned through wisdom rather than warfare, abundance that spoke of harmony between human will and natural law. The hall itself stood modest by the standards of southern Jarls, but perfectly suited to its mountain setting. Timber walls rose from foundations of fitted stone, while the roof bore carved dragon heads that watched over the valley with benevolent rather than threatening expressions. Gardens flourished beside the main building, herbs and vegetables tended with obvious care, their neat rows speaking of hands that understood the delicate balance between cultivation and nature. As they rode down the final slope toward home, a woman emerged from the hall's carved doorway. Her silver-streaked hair caught the morning light as she moved with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to authority. The moment Astrid saw her face, she understood that everything Bjorn had told her about his sister had been carefully constructed fiction. The golden arm ring that encircled the woman's wrist bore the intricate knotwork patterns Astrid had seen on Bjorn's cup, but where those carvings had seemed like memorials to the dead, this piece gleamed with the life of daily wear. As the woman approached their horses, her grey eyes, so similar to Bjorn's, held intelligence and warmth that spoke of a spirit very much among the living. "Sister," Bjorn said simply as he dismounted, and the word fell between them with the weight of revealed truth. Sigrid, for this could be no one else, studied Astrid with the frank assessment of a woman accustomed to reading character at first glance. Her examination held neither judgment nor welcome, simply the careful evaluation of someone determining how a new element might affect the balance of her carefully ordered world. "So this is the barren woman you purchased for 30 silver marks," she said, her voice carrying the dry humor of someone who had learned to find amusement in life's ironies. "I confess curiosity about what drove you to such extravagance." Astrid felt the ground shift beneath her understanding, like scree on a mountain slope. If Sigrid lived, then Bjorn's story of loss and guilt had been deliberately misleading. But why would he create such elaborate fiction unless the truth posed some greater danger than comfortable lies? "I told her you were dead," Bjorn said with the blunt honesty of a man abandoning pretense. Seemed simpler than explaining why the most skilled Volva in the northern kingdoms chooses to live in exile rather than serve kings who would use her gifts for conquest. Volva. The word hit Astrid like a physical blow, recontextualizing everything she thought she understood about her situation. She stood now in the presence of one of the legendary seers whose counsel could topple kingdoms or prevent wars, a woman whose connection to the spirit realm made her one of the most powerful individuals in the Norse world. Such women did not live in comfortable exile without compelling reasons. Your reputation for deception grows more creative with each passing season, Sigrid observed, though her tone held affection rather than accusation. Though I suppose claiming your sister died in childbirth carries more sympathy than admitting she refuses to serve your political convenience. The pieces of a larger puzzle began assembling in Astrid's mind, like fragments of broken pottery revealing their original shape. A legendary warrior who had abandoned conquest for peaceful farming. A Volva in hiding rather than at the court where her gifts would bring wealth and influence. A remote valley, perfectly positioned to remain hidden from the attention of kings and their agents. You are both in exile, she said, understanding flooding through her like cold water. This entire holding is a sanctuary for those who refuse to serve purposes they find distasteful. Bjorn and Sigrid exchanged glances that held the communication of siblings who had shared secrets for decades. In that brief exchange, Astrid glimpsed the careful planning that had created this haven, where inconvenient truths could be spoken freely. King Harald has particular interest in those whose talents serve his expansion plans, Sigrid explained as she led them toward the hall. Warriors who win battles and seers who predict their outcomes both find themselves encouraged to remain close to court. Some of us prefer to choose our own purposes rather than have them chosen for us. The golden arm ring caught the light as she gestured, and Astrid noticed now that its patterns included protective symbols worked with the skill of someone who understood their deeper meanings. This was not mere decoration, but a ward against magical interference, the kind of precaution a Volva would take if she wished to remain hidden from other practitioners of the mystical arts. Inside the hall, Astrid found herself in a space that defied every expectation formed by a lifetime among Jarls and their courts. Where she expected displays of martial prowess, she found shelves lined with books and scrolls that spoke of knowledge gathered from across the known world. The walls bore tapestries that depicted not battles and conquest, but the turning of seasons and the harmony between human cultivation and natural cycles. "This is why you told me I would have choices here," Astrid said as understanding continued to unfold. "Because this entire place exists as an alternative to the expectations that govern women's lives in the world below." Among other things, Sigrid agreed, settling herself on a carved chair that bore symbols of her mystical office, "though I confess interest in learning why my brother felt moved to rescue you specifically. He has shown admirable restraint in his rescue efforts until now." The question hung in the air between them while Astrid struggled to process revelations that overturned everything she thought she knew about her situation. She had believed herself purchased by a remorseful warrior seeking simple redemption through kindness. Instead, she found herself among exiles whose very existence challenged the foundations of royal authority. "Perhaps," she said carefully, "he recognized someone else who had been declared worthless by those who should have valued her differently." Sigrid's laugh held genuine delight, and Astrid saw that she had passed some test whose parameters she had not understood. "Oh, I think we shall get along well, you and I, though I suspect there are aspects of your situation that even my far-seeing brother has not yet recognized." The Volva's grey eyes held depths that seemed to reflect knowledge beyond the merely human, and Astrid felt herself examined by perception that read more than surface appearances. Whatever Sigrid saw in that mystical assessment brought a slight frown to her weathered features. "Interesting. Interesting," she murmured, though she did not elaborate on what had caught her attention. "Very interesting indeed. Brother, I think your rescue may have brought us more than a simple refugee from an unwanted marriage." Bjorn settled beside the hearth with the careful movements of a large man in a space designed for comfort rather than martial display. Your seeing always finds complications where others see simple solutions. What do you perceive that the rest of us have missed? That remains to be determined, Sigrid replied cryptically. But I suspect our guest's true story is only beginning to unfold. Sometimes those declared barren by one set of wise women carry gifts that different eyes might recognize more clearly. The golden arm ring pulsed with beath, faint light as she spoke, and Astrid felt a shiver of possibility that had nothing to do with the mountain cold. In this place where exiles gathered to escape the narrow definitions imposed by kings and customs, perhaps even the most fundamental judgments about her nature might prove open to revision. The weeks that followed brought revelations as startling as mountain avalanches and as gentle as morning mist rising from the lake. Astrid found herself welcomed into a community that existed in deliberate opposition to the rigid hierarchies that had defined her previous life. Here, worth was measured not by bloodline or fertility, but by the contributions each person made to the collective well-being of their chosen family. The ancient rune stone that stood in the center of the settlement bore inscriptions so old their original meaning had been lost to time. Yet Sigrid had taught her to read the patterns that spoke of protection and welcome to those who came in peace. Each morning, Astrid found herself drawn to trace those weathered symbols with her fingertips, feeling a connection to the countless generations of women who had sought sanctuary in places where their true nature could flourish without constraint. During her third week in the valley, Sigrid began teaching her the arts that had been forbidden in her father's hall. Not the mystical practices of the vulva, those required gifts that revealed themselves only to the chosen, but the practical skills that gave women power over their own destinies. She learned to read the subtle signs that warned of weather changes days before storms arrived. She mastered the preparation of medicines that could ease pain, prevent fever, and heal wounds that would otherwise fester into dangerous infections. More importantly, she discovered that her supposed barrenness might be less curse than misunderstood blessing. Sigrid's examination with eyes trained to see beyond surface appearances had revealed something the wise women of Thornwick had missed entirely, signs that suggested not absence of fertility, but its deliberate suppression by a spirit that rejected forced conception. The old knowledge speaks of women whose bodies refused to bear children, conceived without love or willing partnership, Sigrid explained, as they gathered herbs in the mountain meadows above the settlement. Such women may remain barren for years when subjected to unwanted coupling, yet prove abundantly fertile when they choose their own mates and timing. The possibility hung between them like morning mist, beautiful but insubstantial until proven by experience. Astrid had grown so accustomed to thinking of herself as fundamentally broken that the concept of deliberate spiritual choice seemed almost too precious to believe. "How would one know for certain?" she asked, her voice barely audible above the mountain wind that carried the scent of wild thyme and distant snow. "Time will tell," Sigrid replied with the cryptic wisdom that characterized all her pronouncements. "But I suspect your body will begin responding differently now that your spirit has found a home where force holds no authority." The days settled into rhythms that felt more natural than anything Astrid had experienced in her father's hall. She rose with the sun to help with the morning tasks, milking the goats whose bells chimed like distant temple music, gathering eggs from hens that wandered freely through gardens where vegetables grew in careful harmony with wildflowers. The simple acts of tending and nurturing fed something in her soul that had been starving since childhood. Bjorn proved as gentle in daily life as he had been protective during their journey. He made no demands upon her time or attention, but his presence provided a steady anchor that allowed her to explore her new circumstances without fear of sudden upheaval. Their conversations during evening meals revealed a depth of thought and feeling that the songs of his warrior exploits had never captured. "I find myself sleeping better since you arrived," he admitted one evening as they sat beside the lake, watching stars reflect in waters still as polished metal. For years, I have carried the weight of past choices alone. Having someone who understands the burden of being measured against impossible standards makes that weight easier to bear. The ancient runestone caught starlight like a beacon as they spoke, its presence a reminder that their valley had sheltered seekers and refugees for longer than memory could reach. Around them, the night sounds of their mountain home created a symphony of contentment. The distant lowing of cattle, the splash of fish feeding in the shallows, the whisper of wind through pine boughs that had watched over this place since the world was young. But peace, Astrid was learning, could be as fragile as it was precious. The messages that arrived with increasing frequency spoke of growing pressure from King Harold's court, where questions were being asked about the whereabouts of certain valuable individuals who had chosen to make themselves scarce when their services were most needed. The king grows impatient with mysteries, Eric reported after his latest journey to gather news from the trading posts. Word is spreading that he seeks a vulva for some great working, and Sigrid's name features prominently in the discussions of his advisors. The golden arm ring pulsed with faint light as Sigrid absorbed this information, her expression grave with the weight of decisions she had hoped to avoid. And what of the Irish alliance? Has the king found another bride to seal his diplomatic ambitions? That is where the news grows most troubling, Eric continued, his weathered face showing the strain of carrying unwelcome tidings. The negotiations have stalled, partly because the Irish lords question why the first promised bride was withdrawn so abruptly. They suspect deception, or hidden defects that would make alliance with Harold's kingdom inadvisable. Astrid felt the cold hand of political necessity reaching even into their mountain sanctuary. Her father's impulsive reclaiming attempt had apparently created exactly the diplomatic complications she had predicted, and now King Harold faced the choice between admitting error or finding new solutions to his foreign policy problems. Worse yet, Eric continued reluctantly, there are whispers that the king plans to demand Jarl Einar's attendance at court to explain why his daughter proved unsuitable for royal purposes. Such summons rarely end well for those who have failed to serve their sovereign's interests adequately. The weight of consequences settled upon them like gathering storm clouds. Einar's desperate financial situation had driven him to sell her in the first place, and now his clumsy attempt to reclaim her for political advantage threatened to destroy him entirely. Whatever his failures as a father, he did not deserve ruin for choices driven by circumstances beyond his control. "There is something else," Bjorn said quietly, producing a scroll that bore the distinctive seal of royal messengers. "This arrived yesterday, addressed to me personally." The parchment crackled as Sigrid unrolled it, her grey eyes scanning the formal script with growing tension. When she finished reading, her face had gone pale as winter moonlight. "A royal summons," she said simply. "King Harold requests your immediate attendance at court to discuss matters of mutual benefit to crown and kingdom." The language is polite, but the underlying threat is clear enough. The ancient rune stone seemed to lean closer in the gathering darkness, its weathered symbols offering protection that might no longer prove sufficient against the reach of royal authority. Around them, their carefully constructed sanctuary suddenly felt as fragile as morning frost before the rising sun. "He knows we are here," Astrid said, though the words felt like admitting defeat before the battle had properly begun. "He has always known where to find us," Sigrid corrected gently. "Until now, he has simply chosen to allow our exile, rather than force a confrontation that might prove costly to all concerned. But circumstances change, and kings adapt their strategies accordingly." Bjorn's scarred hands were steady as he took the scroll from his sister, but Astrid could see the tension in his shoulders as he contemplated the choice between voluntary service and forcible retrieval. Either path led away from the peace he had worked so hard to build, back into a world that measured worth through violence and political utility. "What would you have us do?" he asked, though they all knew the options were limited. Royal summons were not requests but commands, dressed in polite language, and refusal carried consequences that extended far beyond personal preference. "We prepare," Sigrid said with the calm determination of a Volva who had seen this moment approaching in her dreams for months. "And we decide whether our sanctuary is worth fighting to preserve, or if the time has come to find new ground where our choices can continue to matter." The golden arm ring caught the last light of stars reflecting on still water, its protective magic suddenly seeming insufficient against the gathering forces that threatened to tear their found family apart. Tomorrow would bring decisions that could not be postponed, choices between submission and resistance that would determine whether the freedom they had built together could survive the storm approaching from the south. The king's men arrived with the dawn, their presence announced by the thunder of hooves that echoed off mountain walls like the drums of war. From her position beside the ancient runestone, Astrid counted at least 20 riders, far more than needed for a simple escort, enough to ensure compliance through overwhelming force. Their mail shirts caught the early light like scales on some great serpent descending from the high passes to swallow their sanctuary whole. At their head rode a man whose bearing proclaimed his authority even before the royal banner unfurled in the mountain wind. Earl Sven, the Oathkeeper, King Harald's most trusted enforcer, had come personally to collect those who had chosen exile over service. His presence spoke of royal patience finally exhausted, of accommodations that would no longer be extended to those who preferred their own purposes to their sovereign's will. The silver-mounted horn that hung at Sven's side had sounded the charge at battles that decided the fate of kingdoms, its voice carrying the authority of a king who brooked no defiance of his will. Now it remained silent at his hip, but its presence served as reminder that cooperation would be rewarded while resistance might require more persuasive measures. Bjorn emerged from the hall with the steady composure of a man who had known this moment would come, his own weapons visible but not threatening. Beside him walked Sigrid, her Volva's staff in hand, and the golden arm ring catching sunlight like captured fire. Together, they represented everything King Harald sought to control: martial prowess and mystical insight yoked to purposes larger than personal advancement. "Earl Sven," Bjorn said with formal courtesy that acknowledged rank without suggesting submission, "you honor our humble valley with your presence, though I confess surprise at finding you so far from court at harvest time." "The king's business takes precedence over seasonal concerns," Sven replied, his voice carrying the authority of one accustomed to unquestioned obedience, particularly when that business involves subjects who have forgotten their obligations to the crown that protects them. Astrid felt the weight of 20 pairs of eyes assessing the settlement for signs of resistance or hidden defenses. These were veteran warriors who had learned to read potential battlegrounds with the expertise of long experience, noting escape routes and defensive positions with professional thoroughness. Their presence transformed their peaceful valley into a trap where negotiation might be the only path to survival. What obligations might those be? Sigrid asked with the calm directness that characterized her responses to political pressure. "We harm no one, threaten no royal interests, and ask only to be left in peace to pursue our own understanding of worthwhile life." The silver horn caught morning light as Sven shifted in his saddle, his weathered face showing the strain of a man delivering ultimatums he might personally find distasteful. "The king requires your service in matters touching the realm's security. Irish raiders threaten our coastal settlements, and their shamans work against our people with magics that resist conventional warfare. Your gifts are needed to counter these threats and preserve the peace King Harald has worked to establish." The justification carried the ring of truth mixed with political necessity, creating the kind of moral complexity that made resistance seem selfish rather than principled. Yet, Astrid heard the unspoken implications: serve the king's purposes willingly, or be compelled to serve them through less pleasant means. "And if we decline this honor?" Bjorn asked, though they all knew the answer before Sven provided it. "The king's patience with voluntary cooperation has reached its natural limits," the earl replied with grim honesty. "Those who will not serve the realm's interests freely may find themselves serving them under different circumstances." The ancient rune stone seemed to pulse with protective energy as tensions escalated toward the breaking point that would determine their future. Around them, the settlement's other residents emerged from their daily tasks to witness negotiations that might end the sanctuary they had all come to cherish. These were people who had chosen peace over power, seeking lives measured by their own standards rather than royal expectations. "We need time to consider your offer," Sigrid said carefully, her Volva's staff gleaming with symbols that spoke of powers beyond the merely martial. "Surely the king's generosity extends to allowing us proper contemplation of such momentous decisions." "Until sunset," Sven conceded, though his tone suggested this concession stretched his instructions to their limit. "The king expects his answer before darkness falls, and his patience will not extend beyond that boundary." Astrid watched the earl's forces establish their camp with military precision, creating a perimeter that effectively sealed the valley while maintaining the fiction of negotiation rather than siege. These were men who understood that overwhelming force applied with restraint often achieved better results than violence that left lasting resentments. The silver horn remained silent at Sven's side as he settled his troops for their vigil, but its presence served as constant reminder that royal authority ultimately rested upon the willingness to use force when gentler persuasions failed. By sunset, they would need to choose between submission and resistance, between preserving their sanctuary and protecting their freedom to define their own worth. The family council that gathered in the hall's shadow spoke in whispers that barely disturbed the mountain air. Around them, the settlement's residents moved through their daily tasks with the deliberate calm of people determined not to show fear before those who would judge their worth by different standards. Children played beside gardens where vegetables grew in defiance of political necessity, their laughter a reminder of what might be lost if resistance proved futile. The crystal pendant that Sigrid wore for her most important workings caught fragments of sunlight as she prepared for the mystical consultation that would guide their final choice. This was no mere ornament but a tool of power passed down through generations of Volva who had stood at crossroads where individual will met the crushing weight of royal authority. Its faceted surface held depths that reflected more than light, showing glimpses of possibilities that mortal sight could not perceive. "The runes speak of sacrifice and transformation," she announced after casting the carved bone pieces that had guided her visions since youth. "But their message remains clouded, as though the outcome depends upon choices not yet made by hearts still undecided." Astrid knelt beside the ancient runestone where she had found such comfort during her weeks of healing, her fingers tracing symbols that had offered protection to countless refugees throughout the centuries. Now those weathered markings seemed to pulse with energy that responded to her touch, as though recognizing in her something that even she did not fully understand. "There may be another way," she said quietly, the words emerging from certainty she could not explain. "One that serves honor without requiring anyone to abandon the life they have chosen here." Bjorn's grey eyes held careful attention as she continued, his scarred face showing the hope of a man desperate to avoid choosing between violence and submission. Around them, the crystal pendant's light seemed to grow brighter, as though Sigrid's mystical artifacts were responding to possibilities that conventional wisdom could not grasp. Earl Sven spoke of Irish raiders and hostile magic, Astrid continued, her voice gaining strength as understanding crystallized. But what if the solution to his king's problems comes not from compelling service, but from offering alternatives that serve the same purposes? She rose from her position beside the runestone, feeling power flow through her body like mountain streams fed by melting snow. For weeks, Sigrid had hinted that her supposed barrenness might hide gifts that different eyes could recognize. Now, with royal forces surrounding their sanctuary and sunset approaching like the blade of an executioner's axe, those gifts began manifesting in ways that defied everything she had believed about her own nature. The Irish shamans work their magic from knowledge of the old ways that these lands remember, she said, gesturing toward peaks that had watched over human struggles since the world was young. But this valley has sheltered those who preserve even older knowledge, wisdom that reaches back to the first people who learned to live in harmony with powers beyond royal control. The crystal pendant blazed with sudden brilliance as Sigrid recognized the truth that Astrid's words revealed. Here was the third path that the runes had hinted at, but not clearly shown, not submission or resistance, but transformation that served larger purposes than any king could comprehend. You would offer to counter the Irish magic yourself, Bjorn said, with dawning understanding. Using gifts that have awakened in this place, where such things can flourish without fear of exploitation. I would offer to teach others those same arts. Astrid replied, her voice carrying conviction that surprised even herself. Create a school where those with potential can learn to work with natural forces rather than against them. Serve the realm's need for magical defense, while preserving our freedom to choose how such service is offered. The proposal hung in the air like morning mist that might dissipate or crystallize into something substantial, enough to change the fundamental nature of their situation. Around them, the settlement's residents gathered in growing numbers, their faces showing the hope of people who had found sanctuary and wished to preserve it without sacrificing their principles. The king wants results, not methods, Sigrid observed thoughtfully. If we can offer him effective protection against Irish magical threats, he may be willing to allow us autonomy in how such protection is provided. The crystal pendant's light pulsed in rhythm with Astrid's heartbeat as she felt the full weight of possibility settling upon her shoulders like a cloak woven from starlight and mountain wind. She had come to this valley as a woman declared worthless by those who should have valued her, but now she stood ready to offer gifts that could preserve the sanctuary that had given her life new meaning. Then we make our offer to Earl Sven, Bjorn said, with the quiet determination of a man who had found his purpose in protecting those who chose peace over power. And we trust that honor serves justice better than force serves expediency. The crystal pendant caught the last rays of afternoon sun as they prepared to face the representatives of royal authority with proposals that might preserve their chosen family or see it scattered to the four winds of political necessity. The negotiation that followed would be remembered in the settlement's oral histories as the day when wisdom proved stronger than force, when offered alternatives transformed potential enemies into cautious allies. Earl Sven listened to their proposal with the careful attention of a veteran who had learned that the best victories were those achieved without drawing steel, his weathered face revealing grudging respect for the ingenuity of their solution. The silver-mounted horn remained silent at his side as Astrid demonstrated the gifts that had awakened under Sigrid's guidance, showing how the valley's protective energies could be channeled into workings that would shield coastal settlements from Irish magical attacks. Her abilities, dormant for so long under the crushing weight of others' expectations, flourished in soil that had been prepared by generations of those who chose their own paths. The king will find this arrangement acceptable, Sven concluded after witnessing demonstrations that proved their claims were rooted in genuine power rather than desperate bluffing. Your school will serve the realm's needs while allowing you to maintain the independence you have carved from these mountains. But know that success will be measured by results, not intentions. The months that followed brought changes as profound as they were unexpected. Students began arriving from across the northern kingdoms, young women whose gifts had been dismissed or feared by those who could not understand them, refugees from political marriages who sought alternatives to lives defined entirely by others' needs. Under Astrid's guidance and Sigrid's deeper wisdom, They learned to work with the ancient powers that flowed through the valley like underground streams feeding all life. The teaching staff that Astrid carried became the symbol of their school's philosophy, its simple design speaking of practical wisdom over ostentatious display. Carved from mountain ash by her own hands under Sigrid's patient instruction, it bore runes that spoke not of dominion over natural forces, but of partnership with energies that predated human ambition. Each new student learned to craft their own version, creating tools that reflected their individual understanding of the balance between personal will and natural law. Winter brought news that validated their approach in ways that even skeptical royal advisors could not dismiss. The Irish raids that had threatened the coastal settlements diminished to scattered nuisances as protective workings taught in their mountain school created barriers that hostile shamans found impossible to penetrate. King Harold's acknowledgement of their success came in the form of official recognition for their academy and guaranteed funding that allowed them to expand their efforts. But the greatest transformation was not in their external circumstances, but in the understanding that had grown between Astrid and Bjorn during the long evenings when darkness came early to their mountain valley. Their partnership had evolved from mutual protection to something deeper, built upon shared recognition of worth that transcended traditional definitions of value or purpose. "I find myself thinking of the future differently now," he admitted one night as they sat beside the lake where stars reflected like scattered silver coins. "Not as something to be endured or survived, but as something to be created through choices made with clear intention." The teaching staff rested across her knees as she considered his words, its carved surface warm beneath her fingertips, like living wood that remembered the tree from which it had been shaped. Around them, their valley hummed with the quiet contentment of a community that had found its purpose in serving something larger than individual ambition. "Do you think we have truly escaped the patterns that bound us before?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer. "Or have we simply found better ways to serve our own nature while contributing to something worthwhile?" "Perhaps there is no difference," Bjorn replied, with the gentle wisdom that had drawn her to trust him from their first meeting. "Perhaps freedom lies not in avoiding all service, but in choosing what we serve based on our understanding of what brings meaning to life." Spring brought confirmation of Sigrid's earlier predictions about Astrid's fertility, as her body began responding to love freely given rather than duty grudgingly performed. The child who quickened in her womb would grow up in a community where worth was measured by contribution rather than bloodline, where choices made from wisdom carried more weight than traditions imposed by force. The ancient rune stone that had welcomed so many refugees over the centuries now watched over a new generation of seekers who came not to hide from the world, but to learn different ways of engaging with its challenges. Each morning, students gathered around its weathered bulk to trace symbols that spoke of protection and welcome, carrying those lessons back to communities that needed alternatives to the narrow paths that political necessity often demanded. As summer brought the first harvest festival celebrated in their expanded community, Astrid stood beside Bjorn, watching children play among gardens where vegetables and wildflowers grew in harmony that reflected the deeper balance they had all worked to achieve. The teaching staff in her hand caught sunlight like captured hope, its simple design speaking of possibilities that unfolded when people were free to discover their own worth. The silver pendant that had once connected her to a mother's love now hung beside other tokens, gifts from students whose lives had been changed by their time in the valley, symbols of a found family that stretched across kingdoms and bloodlines to include all those who sought meaning beyond the roles that others would assign them. Looking back toward the path that had brought her from the father's hall to this moment of quiet triumph, Astrid marveled at the journey that had transformed rejection into redemption, shame into strength, and isolation into belonging. Sometimes, she reflected, the greatest gifts came disguised as losses, leading those brave enough to embrace change toward destinations they could never have imagined when their journey first began. The teaching staff gleamed in afternoon light as laughter echoed across water that reflected mountains reaching toward sky, and she knew that she had finally found the worth that had always been hers to claim.